Good evening and welcome to Inside Government for the fall 2017 semester here at Cayuga Community College. This is a show that is broadcast on Spectrum, Verizon Fios, and the Auburn Regional Media Access, better known as ARMA, as well as Win 89, the college's radio station. I'm your host, Guy Cosentino. Last November, the voters in the 54th Senate District, that includes much of Cayuga County and the western half of the city of Auburn, went to the polls to elect a new state senator. Michael F. Nozzolio had represented this community for 25 years in the Senate and another 10 in the Assembly. Voters overwhelmingly elected Republican Pamela HELMING in a three-way race to the Senate against two other candidates with 60% of the vote. First elected to office in 2010, she was the town supervisor of Canandaigua when she ran for the Senate last year. We are delighted to have her back in the studio for her first appearance since taking office. Over the next half hour, we'll talk not only about her freshman year in the Senate, but what issues she concentrated on this year, as well as what she sees coming up in January when the legislature returns. Welcome back to the studio. A little bit more easy this time than last time in a forum.
A little bit.
Yes.
And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Well, we're delighted to have you here to talk about your first year. So you're concluding the first year. You still got a month and a half, a little over a month to go. How'd it go?
I think it was absolutely fantastic. You know, there was some question on my part how the transition from local elected official to state senator was going to go. But I have to say it was absolutely fantastic. I had tremendous support from many of my colleagues in the Senate, which really helped out. But that local government experience paired with my private business experience really helped me out tremendously during this first year.
So let's kind of do a refresher for people who may not remember a year ago, when they most likely heard too much about you at that time. Both good and bad, your stuff and whatever your opponent said. So you were elected originally for the first time in 2010. So
yes.
You've been an office holder for a relatively short period of time, about 7 years.
Yes.
Before that. What's your business experience?
So I worked for a number of years in the environmental field. I did environmental inspections, training, permitting, and compliance for a waste company. I traveled all over New York State and Pennsylvania in that capacity. I also worked for a commercial builder. So when you talk about rules and regulations, which often come up as a concern for small business owners, I had experience really on both sides of the table, like I said, in the private industry and also as a local elected official.
So in a year where algae blooms were the norm, having some environmental experience most likely helped.
It was a phenomenal help. And I have to say that it was shocking to me that this is the first year that every single one of our Finger Lakes had blue-green algae, and it was a tremendous amount of concern. I fought during my first budget cycle to make sure that we had funding in the budget for our lakes and for source water protection. You probably are aware that we achieved record funding, $2.5 billion for lake protection efforts. And those dollars will go to help our communities here in the Finger Lakes. But what I really learned a lot about is you really have to fight hard to get the money into the budget. You have to fight equally hard to get it back out for your communities. So I've been working with a number of communities here in Cayuga County and the other 5 counties that I represent to get their fair share of funding for infrastructure projects that will help provide all of our residents with clean drinking water and help our lakes stay fresh and clean.
So we'll come back to your freshman year. Let's talk about algae bloom because we're on that.
Okay.
So for those who don't remember, your district goes as far as Lake Ontario up north. You have a large chunk of the city of Auburn. You go past Canandaigua into Webster and Monroe County and down to Lansing in Tompkins County.
Yes.
So you got a big area. How many lakes are in all that?
Four of the Finger Lakes, and then as you mentioned, a portion of Lake Ontario as well.
Which is a whole different subject we'll get to because that's just literally water everywhere. So let's talk about algae blooms. So with the money that's coming in and the money that will go out and the money that you're working to get to your constituents and their local governments, is that what's needed to be done to address this issue of algae blooms?
That's part of it. We definitely need to do additional research to understand what's happening, what's prompting these algae blooms. You know, for a while, and I think we focused on this last year when I was here, we talked about the amount of phosphorus. And there are a lot of people pointing the fingers at our agricultural partners and talking about the runoff from the farms. Well, we now know that it's not just phosphorus, but nitrogen's involved as well. And then we look at Skinny Atlas Lake, which really doesn't have such an issue with nutrient overloading. So New York State...
Basically the agricultural community dumping into the lake by accident, not
Yes.
not that they're dumping manure in.
Yep.
So with that, you have the Finger Lakes Institute, which has really been very involved with the Owasco Lake Watershed Association here, and has been doing, it's Professor Halfman, I think it is, who's been doing testing for the last, let's say, 10 years or plus. Does more money go to Hobart and that group in Geneva to do more testing for analysis?
Yes, I do believe that there will be additional funding going to Finger Lakes Institute to do additional testing. But I think just as important is this year the New York State DEC formed a hub, it's called. And this group of individuals will be responsible for monitoring the data and the work that's being done on each of the lakes, so we can collaborate, learn from each other, learn what the differences are and the similarities. But again, I think there's so much more that needs to be done so that we can understand what's driving the blue-green algae and how we are going to deal with it.
So you're not convinced it's any one particular source at this stage?
I do not believe that there is one smoking gun. I think it's a number of issues. You know, we talked about agriculture. I definitely think there are contributing factors from farms. I think overdevelopment on some of the lakes. You know, we don't leave enough space to have natural purification, sediment settling out, etc. There are septic system issues around our lakes where we don't have sewers. So in the New York State budget, this is something that I'm very proud of. We do have programs like a septic system rebate program to help replace failing septic systems for people who live along lakes. We do have a program that will allow municipalities to apply for it's called a buffer program, so to purchase small pieces of land that could stay forever natural to allow for a natural buffer or filtration before waters flow into the lake. There are a number of very good programs out there. I've been working with a number of municipalities, encouraging them to apply for the money. That's the only way we can get it out to our communities if application is made.
So usually the two culprits that they identify, so let's talk about both of them. One has been this issue of overdevelopment, and it is that a lot of people want to live in lakes now. That they used to have a camp that was not all year round. It was because they couldn't run water all year round or anything, but now on many of the lakes, people want to live there all year. So we've got bigger footprints with blacktop, where it used to be crusher run, where water could, things could drain in. Do we have to get to the point where we're looking at development as a state issue versus a patchwork of communities? So what Canandaigua decides to do over there might be different than what Owasco does. I know you don't represent Owasco, but Fleming.
Sure.
Do we have to now come up with an overall system, or is it still up to localities to do the policing?
I will always be a strong advocate for staying at the local level of government when it comes to development. I think at the local level you could do the best in balancing, the issues. But that's an interesting question in that I believe that most of our communities are doing a much better job with development oversight on our lakefronts. But what we need to do and what we need to train our local planning boards and zoning boards to do is look beyond the lakefront development. Our watersheds are huge. There's runoff that comes from upstream properties. So maybe from a county standpoint, taking a look at how proposed projects are going to impact the watershed and how that will impact our lakes long term.
So that's one piece. The other piece you mentioned was agriculture. And one of the criticisms that we've heard locally here has been that while, for example, the city of Auburn, I think Owasco are able to control the Owasco watershed, control is a loose term. They can do some regulations, but they can't regulate agriculture because that's up to the state to really get involved. Should the state be taking more of a role or listening to communities in a different way?
I think the state does a good job when it comes to agriculture and runoff concerns. The DEC is out there not only enforcing, but also educating. And in the New York State budget, we have literally millions and millions. I think it's $500 million for manure management. And farmers are under a lot of strict regulations. Large dairy farms, for instance, must have what's called a CAFO plan, and those CAFO plans were just revised. The regulations behind them were revised, so they're more stringent than ever.
And are people still in application process to get those CAFO certificates again?
The manure storage.
Yes.
So there are two things.
Okay.
And sorry if I...
It's okay. No, explain, because you're talking about somebody who may not know anything.
So a CAFO plan has to be reviewed on a routine basis. I don't know what that is, if it's an annual, 5-year, 10-year cycle.
Because I know the city council has been discussing it in Auburn about where the permits are. Okay.
But the manure storage, the grant process is open and available, and large dairy farms and others are encouraged to apply for the funding.
Okay. So any big surprises in the first year? Let's go back to your first year. That's what we started with. Any big surprises in the first year?
I wouldn't say that there were any real surprises. It's a much faster pace than the local level.
Than being a town supervisor. Canandaigua was still a big town, though.
Yeah. So going from a community of 11,000 people to representing more than 300,000 people, definitely a change. I absolutely love it. I love everything that I'm doing. I've made a real priority to be out there visiting all of the communities. Since coming back from Albany in June, from July through this month, I've held 11 town hall mobile office hours from one end of the district to the other. I have 2 more planned. I've done 3 here in Cayuga County, and the feedback and the attendance, it's just been incredible. I've attended so many events, you know, you name it, parades, visiting firehouses, you name it. I've tried to be just about everywhere, and that feedback has been incredible. For me to hear firsthand from people what's important to them is going to help me.
So what are they telling you?
You name it, just about everything.
Is it government regulation? Is it government corruption? Is it their taxes are too high? I'm sure nobody's telling you their taxes are too low. Yeah.
Surprisingly, though, the tax question doesn't come up very often in these meetings. It's more about assistance they may need to make improvements in their communities. It may be a family member who's trying to access services for an individual, say with special needs, and they just don't know where to go, or they've hit a brick wall, and we're able to help them through that.
Which is an interest of yours.
Yes, yes.
You're very interested in children and adults with special needs. Why? What's your, I don't mean why are you interested? Where do you come from that says, well, this is important to me? Yeah, so first I'd like to say that I'm interested in all people, and their stories just fascinate me and their experiences. But working with the developmentally disabled, when I first graduated from college way back many years ago, I landed a job in Fairport working with adults with developmental disabilities. So it's always... so that empathy has traveled decades. When my husband and I were married 30 years ago, we were married in Ohio. 2 of the group homes I was working with, they actually traveled out with us and participated in our wedding. And so it's just always been, I find, like I said, all people to be fascinating, and people who don't dwell on what their challenges are, but are always looking forward to, what can I do next? How can I improve? And I'm so inspired by people like that. So a couple things that you just touched on. You mentioned you've been making a lot of visits, and clearly we did not schedule well because we have you here on a Tuesday, but you were in Auburn yesterday for 2 different events. What were you doing here in Auburn yesterday? So we started out in the morning. We met with the city manager, Jeff, and we also met with the city clerk, Chuck, and we talked a lot about what's happening in Auburn. It's truly amazing to look at the downtown area and just see the transformation that's occurred over the past several years, and to hear this about what's planned going forward, and to find out how I can be of assistance, whether it's through grant funding, whether it's through legislation, how I can help facilitate and move things forward for the city of Auburn. You know, there's a lot going on related to the Harriet Tubman Center and the new visitor center that's proposed with the Taste of New York. So there's a lot of great, exciting things going on. After a meeting with the city, we went over and we visited with the police chief and also with the fire chief. We had a wonderful... Chief Butler and Chief Morbido, okay. Yes, we had a wonderful lunch with the fire department. I appreciate them, you know, taking the time to prepare us wonderfully. They wanted me to make sure I mentioned a healthy lunch. It was salad with grilled chicken, but no. I know some of those firefighters, I'm not sure about that, but you may have been the exception for the day. So they just do an incredible job. So speaking of the fire department, because I know you've been very involved, I was reading through some of the items that your staff sent over, and they were very nice about it. You've been very involved in talking to volunteer fire departments and paid. But why volunteer fire departments right about now?
Volunteer fire departments, you know, they do so much for our communities, and I could speak to that as a town supervisor. Without the volunteer company, I don't know how we could have met some of our budgetary needs.
So is Canandaigua itself, the city, is that a paid department and the town volunteer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So this year, one of my priorities was to make sure that I was able to achieve the same level of funding that Senator Zolio has been able to get in the past for our volunteer firefighters. And we fought long and hard for that, but we were able to secure $500,000 for Finger Lakes fire departments. So I utilized that money. This year I did a little bit different. I distributed the money to more than 70 fire departments in my district, which I think, you know, goes out to help them with everything from buying equipment they need to hoses, whatever it is.
But you've also been touting this issue of cancer coverage for volunteer fire departments. So what exactly is that?
So, you know, one of the challenges that volunteer companies face is the lack of volunteers. And we see a steady decline. And part of that is because there's a number of demands. You have to be available 24/7. The training requirements continue to increase. And then there are more and more volunteer firefighters being diagnosed with cancers related to their service. So this year we were able to achieve legislation that grants volunteer firefighters similar coverage, cancer coverage, medical cancer coverage as our paid.
So paid departments are already covered through their workers' comp or other policies?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
So what does this cancer coverage cover?
It covers cancers that are attributed to line of work, line of duty. So there's a number of testing that's done before you become a firefighter. There's testing that's done while you're a firefighter, and then if you're diagnosed with cancer.
So there are steps and levels that cover the coverage in there.
Yes.
One of your thoughts, I take it from your comments, is that your hope is that this will be another reason, one less reason for people not to volunteer for their departments.
Exactly, exactly.
Do you have 70, you have how many volunteer?
I want to say 82.
82.
It's somewhere around that number.
So those other 12 will be looking for you, by the way.
Well, actually, I reached out to every single volunteer company.
So, so there you were at the fire department yesterday. Then you went and it was a guest we were supposed to have next week, Jeff Parazzolo, the Auburn superintendent. You went to the schools. Where did you go yesterday?
We met with the superintendent and several members of his leadership team to talk about Auburn schools, some of the challenges that they're having, of course related, most of it was related to school funding.
So a big issue for this community is how foundation aid is calculated, and there has been a question. They had some issues dealt with, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, but there's been some formula questions since then. Is that where the concentration of discussion was, that they really need this formula rejiggered, or else they have a multi-million-dollar shortfall? So
first, let me say that that was a priority of the Senate majority, was to make sure that our schools and our children had the necessary funding in place so that they can receive a good, solid education. This year, there's $26 billion in the budget for education. That's over $1 billion more than last year. So just want to make that very clear, that people understand there were no cuts to education in the state budget. There was an increase, over $1 billion increase. In the case of the Auburn City School District, they have a concern with one component of the foundation formula. And yesterday we discussed that. They're definitely looking for additional funding. I'm going to do what I can to help them. I'll be setting up a meeting with Senate Finance and others to see if we can delve into that a little bit more and get Auburn the help they need. So for Auburn, is it just rejiggering it or reclassifying what foundation aid is? Is there a way to check a box and they now qualify? Their argument has been that they are qualified for it and the executive branch has not qualified them for it. I think that, if I'm summarizing it correctly. So the foundation aid formula, which was designed by a man in a little room in this behemoth known as the Department of Education. I'm not sure that anyone can explain exactly how it works, but there's a component of it, the independent wealth it's the IWI, Independent Wealth something, but that's where Auburn is having an issue. And they also shared with us yesterday that they found that there are 155 schools throughout New York State who are having that same issue. And they would like that one component adjusted. Based on, you know, I've only been in office 11 months, but based on what I've seen is, it's unlikely that one component of the foundation aid formula will be adjusted. Now, if you start adjusting other components, that's going to skew what Auburn and the other schools do or don't get.
So you think it's unlikely that they would just change that one component at this stage? It's a tough fight.
I think it's going to be a tough fight.
Is it even tougher because...
I think it's going to be an easier fight to be a strong advocate for Auburn and to point to the accomplishments. That school district has done amazing. They have seen a reduction in funding, but they've also seen an increase in their graduation rates. My concern is that they're at a tipping point now. They have done as much as they can with less funding, but now they're at that point where they can't reduce anymore. You know, they've had to cut business teachers, and when I'm out and about talking to local businesses, they can't get enough employees, skilled, trained employees. So when I hear about our high schools cutting business programs and business teachers, it's really of concern because I know there's a greater impact to that. They also have had to cut some mental health services at a time when this state and this country is faced with the addiction problems that we have. Now is not the time to cut funding to mental health programs. So I will do whatever I can to support Auburn and all my schools.
So is it going to be a tougher year this year? Because we're hearing from the comptroller, Senator DeFrancisco, as I mentioned, was on last week. It looks like I thought I heard a $4 billion shortfall, and we still got months to go. Right. Is it going to be a tougher year next year?
That's the sense that I'm getting, that it will be a tougher year.
So usually there's only two ways to close a $4 billion shortfall, other than if you come up with these creative issues that governors tend to come, Republican and Democrat, doesn't matter, yeah. Is either raise taxes or cut funding.
Yeah.
What do you see happening?
I think that we have to look at our spending and find ways to make cuts. I don't favor increasing taxes at all. Not at all. We can't do that. We're already one of the highest, or the highest, tax state in the nation. So we're going to have to look at making responsible decisions. You know, if I give an example of where I think there can be a cut made, sure, it's going to offend folks. But I mean, there are some, for instance, a gondola at the state park, or State Fair. Is that something that we need? Decorative lights on bridges. I'd like to see more money going towards the repair of our roads and bridges.
So right now you are concerned heading into this budget that New York is not on the right track financially.
Right. I think we need to be more responsible in how we spend the taxpayers' dollars.
So as a town supervisor, you know that everything flows down.
Yeah.
So for New York State, it flows down from Washington. Are you worried about the federal tax plan right now and how it will impact New York State and New Yorkers at this stage?
Yeah.
Or is there not enough information yet?
Exactly. So I'm watching closely, monitoring it closely, as I know all my colleagues are. But at this point, I think it would be premature to make any comments. I think we need to see what actually happens and then figure out what our plan is going to be to address it.
When the Senate and the House.
Yes.
But getting rid of the whole issue of federal deductibility of state and local taxes, that's a non-starter for you?
Right, yes.
That alone is enough to...
Right.
Okay. Speaking of the House, though, John Faso, who used to be in the Assembly, and Chris Collins, two New York representatives, have come up with this idea that Medicaid be taken over by the state of New York. It's the only state that swaps it down to the localities. Governor Cuomo is opposed to it. He's made it very clear, specifically about Chris Collins, who I don't think they should be in the same room together.
Yeah.
Do you support the idea of Medicaid being a state responsibility versus a county, half county responsibility, less than half now, but a county responsibility? You
know, I don't feel like I can weigh in on that based on Faso and Congressman Collins' comments. I need to see the data, I need to see the facts and the figures, and I'm sure it will be something that we'll be discussing when we return in January.
What else do you think will be on the agenda in January?
I think we'll be discussing health care. I'm sure that will come up. But I just quickly wanted to, you brought up Congressman Collins. I did want to give a shout out to Congressman Collins and Congressman Katko for their work to get the FEMA declaration for the counties who suffered through the Lake Ontario flooding.
So we're going to take 2 minutes and talk about, so this show goes up there as well. So what's the situation on Lake Ontario?
Lake Ontario, I don't know if you're aware or not, but I held a public hearing a couple of weeks ago with Senator O'Mara and several other senators, Senator DeFrancisco as well, Senator Funke, and a number of assembly folks. We had the chairwoman of the International Joint Commission, several other.
So for those who don't know, the lake level is not controlled by anybody but this International Commission.
That is correct.
And it sounds like not too many of you are supportive of their work.
I'm not a fan of their work.
So who should control the lake level?
So I think maybe IJC is the appropriate International Joint Commission, maybe the appropriate commission. However, I think we need representation from upstate New York, someone who is familiar with Lake Ontario and the impacts of the flooding on our communities. We need representation there. So
is that the biggest priority in regards to the lake issue up there, is representation? That's
one of the priorities. The second priority is making sure that our property owners, our small business owners, and our municipalities get the funding they need to rebuild so that they can open and operate next season.
I want to talk about 2 other quick items. One is there's a governor's race next year.
Well, can I just mention, on the Plan 2014, because there's
this is in regards to
Lake Ontario flooding. So for some of our smaller communities, this has had a tremendous negative impact on them. And my concern is that unless the IJC makes a change to Plan 2014, the water level thresholds, that our communities can expect to be flooded out again. So I implore our federal government to do something to help us out. Right now, the highest high when water will be released from Lake Ontario is greater than when some of our small communities like Sodas Point begin to flood. So it makes no sense.
So I want to ask you about 2 quick items. One is the governor's race. You have 2 people you work with. Brian Kolb, the Assembly Minority Leader, is in the same, overlays much of your same district. Senator John DeFrancisco, who is a colleague in the Senate, they're both possibly running for governor. Have you decided who you're supporting?
I have not, but what I have done is facilitated meeting with different groups in my district.
For both of them?
Actually for 4 people.
Oh, okay.
So for Assembly Minority Leader Brian Kolb, for Senator DeFrancisco, also for Mark Molinaro and Harry Wilson. So there are 4 candidates, or 4 people considering the possibility of a run.
But have both the Minority Leader and the Deputy Majority Leader, have they both been lobbying you heavily?
No.
Okay.
No.
So the other thing is, just before we started, I said what you're doing for Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, we're going to take 1 minute and talk about this. You have 2 children.
Yes.
One son is going down to Virginia to go see a friend.
Yes.
But you have a son coming from where?
Son-in-law and daughter coming from Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
And your son-in-law just completed what?
He just, this past August, he graduated from Special Operations, the Green Beret program.
At Fort Bragg? At
Fort Bragg.
And you were able to participate in the ceremony?
I was. So my son-in-law is a captain in the Army. He's a West Point graduate. And my daughter works for the Army at the medical center on base at Fort Bragg. She's an orthopedic physician's assistant. So they'll be coming home. But yes, one of the greatest things that I was able to do as both a mother-in-law, and also as a state senator, was attend the Green Beret graduation ceremony. Well, I'm going to get choked up now.
It's okay.
It was the most moving experience of my entire life. Over 3,000 men applied to that program, 130 graduated. The commitment they make to this country, our country, it's just so moving. And because I was a New York State Senator, I got to participate in a small portion of the ceremony. And like I said, it was an incredible experience. And I just want to say—
So let's mark that as the high point?
Yeah, God bless all of our troops and all of our soldiers. What they do for us is just incredible.
Well, I wanted to get that in because it was just a great story we were talking on before we went on the air. 30 minutes goes really fast.
It does.
We'd love to have you back in the spring. Give us an update on what's going on in Albany. We didn't cover 2/3 of what was on my list.
Right.
It's okay?
I'd love to come back.
We'll love to have you.
Okay.
Our guest has been New York State Senator Pamela Helming. We want to thank her for joining us and giving us an update on Albany and what she's been doing not only so far this year, but to give us an update of what she expects on the agenda in January, and we hope she'll come back to join us. We'll return in just a moment with Beyond the Front Page with a discussion about the renovation plans for the Shines Theater in downtown Auburn with Cuyahoga County Arts Council President Ed O'Norrie and City Planning Director Jennifer Haynes. We'll be back next week with our final show of the season with 2 Inside Government shows. On Tuesday, the first kind of finishes our triumvirate of shows with state senators. We've had Senator Helming this week, Senator DeFrancisco last week, Senator James L. Seward will be in with us next week. Then we'll finish off with a city update with City Manager Jeff Dygert. We had planned to have a show with Auburn School Superintendent Jeff Parazola and Business Manager Lisa Green to give us an update on Foundation A, which we just talked about a moment ago. They've asked to put that off until the spring, and we'll do that. And next Thursday, we will finish our final show, as we do every year, with our annual last guest. Yes, that is correct. Santa Claus will be back in the studio. Before we go, though, we would like to let you know that you can send us your questions and thoughts for future guests on Inside Government or Beyond the Front Page. You can contact us at COZGUYTHO@AOL.com or Inside Government, 141 Dunning Avenue, Auburn, New York, 13021. I'm Guy Cosentino for Cuyahoga Community College. We want to thank you for watching. Hope you stick around for Beyond the Front Page, but we want you to have a good night, have a great tomorrow, and happy Thanksgiving.